The wind screamed across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, raw and relentless. Dust spun in tight funnels across the ravaged earth, sweeping over broken fences and brittle grass that hadn't tasted rain in months. The land was hard, mean-spirited even, and it chewed up the weak without apology. It was the sort of day that made even the coyotes stay quiet. Elias Hart crested a ridge atop a lean, dun-colored horse. His shoulders were hunched against the wind, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His face, carved by sun and silence, bore a thick scar running from behind his left ear to the edge of his collarbone. He didn't speak much. Hadn't in years. Most folks figured he couldn't. Others figured he just didn't see the point. Below him, the valley spread out in scorched browns and grays. Smoke curled black and bitter from a distant patch of woods. Not the kind from a cook fire. No, this was the ugly kind. The kind that followed cruelty. He nudged his horse forward. A mile later, he saw them. 3 figures, bound to a half-burned fence post where the trail split around a dying cottonwood. A woman, hair tangled, mouth gagged, wrists swollen from the ropes, and 2 young girls, clinging to her sides with trembling limbs. One child couldn't have been more than 10, the other 6 at most. Barefoot, filthy, sunburnt. The woman raised her eyes as he approached. They didn't plead. They demanded. Demanded not rescue, but justice. Elias dismounted without a word. He drew his knife. The blade hissed through the cords. The woman sagged forward, then caught herself. She yanked the gag free and croaked a hoarse whisper. "My daughters!" Elias lifted the youngest first. She barely weighed anything, like lifting a sack of bones. Then the older girl, who stared at him with eyes too old for her face. Finally, the mother. She hissed through clenched teeth as he took her arm, but she didn't resist. He pointed to his horse. She hesitated, then nodded. He hoisted the girls up first, then helped her swing her leg over. She swayed, clutched the saddle horn, and looked down at him. Why are you helping us?" He didn't answer. Just started walking. By the time they reached his shack, a weather-beaten structure tucked in a gully ringed with cedar and rock, the sun had slipped below the hills. The air turned sharp with cold. Elias built a fire from stacked kindling and dry brush, heating the cramped space quickly. Inside, it smelled of tobacco, horsehair, and old pine. He passed out cornbread and poured water into a dented tin cup. The girls drank first. Then the woman, slow and wary. She watched him closely. "My name's Clara," she said at last, her voice low, brittle. "This here's May and Ruth." The older girl looked up when her name was spoken. The younger clung to her mother's arm, eyes wide and unblinking. Clara swallowed hard. "My husband owed money to the wrong men. He thought he could pay it back before winter. He was wrong." Elias sat still, his boots near the fire, face unreadable. "They came 2 nights ago," Clara continued. "Burned the house. Took everything. Left us tied to that fence. Thought we'd freeze, or the wolves would get us." She shivered despite the heat. "I prayed someone might find us, but no one ever comes out this far." Elias shifted slightly, pulled a blanket from the cot and handed it over. Clara took it. "You have a name?" He paused. Then pointed at the wall, where a branding iron was nailed. The initials EH rusted into the iron. She nodded slowly. "Elias." His eyes flicked to hers. Then away. "Thank you," she whispered. The fire popped. May fell asleep leaning against her mother's side, her face smudged with soot. Ruth curled beside her, breathing shallowly. Clara stroked their hair, silent for a while. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. "But I'm grateful. I didn't think we'd live to see the morning." Outside, the wind wailed again, but softer now, like it had lost some of its anger. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat by the door, rifle across his lap, watching shadows move across the snow-bleached yard. His ears strained for sounds, footsteps, hooves, voices carried by the wind. None came. The next morning, Clara insisted on boiling water. She scrubbed her daughters' faces with a worn rag, helped them dress in clothes Elias had tucked away in a trunk. Old shirts, too big, but warm. He handed her a needle and some thread without a word. She raised her eyebrows, then smiled faintly. "I can sew." He nodded. They fell into a rhythm, of sorts. Clara cleaned the dishes, fixed a broken hinge on the shack's only cabinet. Elias chopped wood, checked his traps, and came back each night with a rabbit or two. They didn't speak much, but there was a growing understanding between them, a silent thread weaving them together. On the fourth evening, Clara found a rusted tin box behind some books on the shelf. She opened it gently. Inside was a photograph, worn and curled at the edges, a group of men in Union blue, their faces grim and young. Elias stood at the edge, a hand on another man's shoulder. She looked up. "Your brother." Elias hesitated, then nodded once. "War took him." He reached for the scar beneath his jaw, ran his fingers along its jagged line, then set the photo down. "You haven't spoken since?" No answer. Just a long breath through the nose. Clara didn't press further. Later that night, as the girls lay nestled under the blanket Elias had given them, Clara knelt by the fire, warming her hands. "I used to think a man had to speak for you to understand him," she said softly, not looking at him. "But now, I think the quiet ones see more, feel more." Elias didn't move, but something in his gaze changed. He met her eyes for a heartbeat longer than usual. Then he stood, stepped outside, and stared at the horizon. In the distance, clouds gathered like bruises. Snow was coming. The kind that buried everything, tracks, trails, and secrets. But for the first time in years, Elias didn't face it alone. The snow began before sunrise. At first, just a dusting across the hills, delicate and quiet. But by mid-morning, it thickened, swirling in sheets that swallowed the world in white. Elias' heart moved like a shadow through it, splitting logs with a rusted axe, breath fogging in front of his face. His coat was old but thick, stitched along the seams with patchwork leather. Behind him, smoke trailed gently from the chimney of his shack. Inside, Clara sat beside the hearth with her daughters tucked close. The older one, Lila, was quiet, protective, always watching her mother's face. The younger, Ruth, clung to a frayed quilt and stared wide-eyed at the dancing flames. Clara's lip was cracked, a thin line of dried blood still at the corner. Rope burns ringed her wrists, angry and raw, but her eyes remained alert. When Elias entered, he brought with him the smell of pine and cold air. He knelt without a word, placing a bundle of firewood near the stove. Ruth flinched as the door slammed shut behind him. Lila reached for her hand. "Thank you," Clara said softly. Elias looked at her and gave a small nod. His silence, once strange, now held its own language. Clara studied him as he worked. How careful his movements were, how he kept his distance but always knew what needed doing. He checked the latch on the door, hung wet coats by the fire, and placed a kettle over the flames without ever speaking. He was a man carved by solitude. Later, when the snow turned violent, Elias handed Clara a wool coat, too large, patched at the elbows. She pulled it tight around herself. He had already wrapped the girls in fur blankets, fed them warm stew from the last of his smoked venison. He handed them water from a pewter cup, kneeling as he waited for each to drink. Ruth coughed once and Elias's brow furrowed. That night, as wind battered the wooden walls, Clara couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm, the crack of ice against shingles. A memory returned, ropes digging into her skin, the burning heat of the fire, the cruel laughter of the men who had done it. She turned and saw Elias sitting by the window, rifle across his lap. Awake. Watching. Clara rose, wrapped in the oversized coat, and crossed to him. "You haven't slept," she whispered. He didn't look at her, only adjusted the rifle's position and scanned the dark. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. He didn't answer. She sat beside him anyway. They stayed that way for a while, listening to the wind and the occasional groan of the old cabin's bones. Then Clara glanced at the shelf nearby, where a worn leather-bound book sat atop a stack of tools. A corner of something stuck out, yellowed paper, frayed at the edge. She reached and gently pulled it free. It was a photograph, cracked with age. A group of men in uniform, standing before a battered encampment. Elias was there, barely recognizable without his beard, a hand on the shoulder of a young man with the same eyes. "Your brother?" she asked. Elias turned to her. Slowly, he nodded. "What happened to him?" His hand lifted to his throat. He pulled aside his collar. A long, jagged scar cut down from his jaw to his chest. The war had taken his voice. Clara's breath caught, not just from the wound, but from what it meant. Silence wasn't a choice for Elias. It was survival. She folded the photo gently and handed it back. "I'm sorry," she said. His eyes held hers a moment longer than expected. There was something unspoken there. Pain, yes, but also understanding. And maybe, just maybe, the start of something healing. Days passed. The snow didn't stop. The world outside vanished beneath drifts taller than a man's waist. Elias worked tirelessly, shoveling paths, checking the roof, feeding the fire. He gave the girls small chores, stacking kindling, sweeping the floor. Tasks that made them feel useful. Clara offered to help split wood, but Elias shook his head. She didn't argue. But when he left one morning to hunt, she chopped vegetables for stew, cleaned the shelves, and stitched the torn corner of a curtain. She needed to move, to do something, to reclaim a sliver of normal. When Elias returned that afternoon, he placed a rabbit on the table, then paused, noticing the neatness, the fresh scent of herbs, the repaired curtain. He met Clara's eyes, said nothing, but he stayed standing a little longer that day before heading back outside. That evening, the girls drew in the frost on the windowpane. Ruth giggled for the first time in weeks. Lila, more cautious, smiled too. Clara watched Elias watching them. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. Then, one night, the world cracked open. Elias awoke to a sound he hadn't heard in years, a man's drunken laugh, muffled by snow. He moved like breath, silent, precise. He opened the door and stepped out barefoot into the freezing dark. The first man was near the barn. Another moved along the back fence. Elias counted 4 shadows. He lowered his rifle, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The crack shattered the silence. One body hit the snow. The others scattered. Elias sprinted. His steps were sure, practiced. He disappeared into the storm and reappeared behind one of the intruders, knife in hand. No words, no sound, just motion. The second fell with a grunt. The third fired blindly, missed, then turned to run. Elias didn't chase. He waited. When the man reappeared at the edge of the tree line, Elias fired once. Clean. Precise. The fourth came at him swinging. Young, foolish, screaming curses into the wind. Elias dodged, grabbed his arm, twisted, and slammed him into the snow. A heartbeat later, the man was unconscious. Elias returned, bleeding from a gash on his forearm. Clara opened the door, the rifle in her hands. Her face turned pale at the sight of the blood, but she stood firm. "They came back," she said, voice trembling. Elias nodded. "You stopped them." He lowered his eyes. The snow melted on his shoulders, soaking into his shirt. "You saved us again." Still, he said nothing. But he looked at her longer than before. In the days that followed, Clara tended his wound. She cleaned the gash, stitched it tight with shaking hands, and wrapped it with strips of linen. He never flinched. She asked no more questions. She didn't need answers. The girls, once timid, grew bolder. Ruth followed Elias around the cabin, mimicking his walk. Lila asked if he would teach her how to track rabbits. He nodded. One morning, as the snow finally began to melt, Ruth drew with a twig in the frost outside the shack. A crooked picture. Clara, Lila, herself, and Elias. He stood over her shoulder and stared. Then he bent down, took the twig, and drew a small dog beside them. The girls burst into laughter. Clara, watching from the doorway, smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled without pain behind it. Spring wasn't yet in full bloom, but something had changed. The air felt lighter, the silence warmer, and when Elias sat beside the fire that night, Lila crawled into his lap without asking. He didn't move. He didn't push her away. Clara watched the flickering glow of the fire touch his weathered face, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might survive this wilderness, not just the land, but what life had done to them. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she would face it with this quiet man who spoke only in actions and protected them with every fiber of his being. And that was enough, for now. The thaw came slowly. Rivers that had once frozen stiff now trickled again, tentative and cautious beneath a crust of breaking ice. The sky, though still pale, carried more light. Sap stirred in the trees. Birds returned in uncertain bursts of song. And with spring's slow return, Clara felt her body ease for the first time in months. Yet peace was a fragile thing. One morning, Elias led Lila and Ruth into the woods, teaching them how to spot deer tracks in soft mud. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. Lila listened closely, asking sharp questions. Ruth bounded ahead, more excited than focused, her hand occasionally brushing against Elias's coat for reassurance. Clara had begun to walk without flinching. Her wrists, though still scarred, were healing. She'd found a rhythm to life here. Gathering eggs from the coop, boiling water over the fire, braiding Ruth's hair in the early hours. Elias never intruded. But he was there, always, mending tools, repairing the fence, ensuring there was never a moment of fear he didn't face first. Still, something tightened in Clara's chest with every warming day. They couldn't stay hidden forever. That night, after the girls were asleep, she sat at the table with Elias. Between them sat a chipped mug of tea. She waited until he looked up from sharpening his knife. "They'll come again," she said, voice low. "Not the same ones, but others. Men like them. People talk. They'll wonder what happened to the girl who ran. To the ones who didn't come back." Elias didn't move. "I can't run anymore," she added. "Not with the girls. Not again." He nodded slowly. Clara's fingers trembled around the cup. "I need to know, if we stay, would we be safe?" Elias leaned back. He pulled a charcoal stub from a drawer and a folded piece of thick paper. After a moment's pause, he sketched something quick and sure: a hilltop, shaded trees, a fork in the path. Then a box. A cabin. He pointed to it, then tapped the surrounding trees. He was showing her defenses, watchpoints, escape routes. Clara leaned closer. "You've prepared for this." His eyes met hers. There was no pride in them, no boast. Only a quiet, relentless determination. He had lived with danger long enough to never underestimate it. The silence between them changed. It wasn't heavy. It held understanding. And gratitude. "I'll stay," she whispered. "If you'll have us." Elias didn't write anything more. He simply reached forward and gently turned her teacup so the handle pointed to her again. The next weeks passed with quiet industry. Elias dug trenches near the tree line, reinforced the barn walls, and began building a second shelter camouflaged by branches. Clara learned how to load the rifle. She practiced with it every morning at a wooden target until her shoulder bruised and her aim improved. Lila grew stronger too. Elias taught her how to string a bow, how to move without snapping branches, how to read the sky. Ruth mostly giggled and chased after butterflies, but even she stopped flinching at the sound of heavy boots. They became something like a family, not in name but in function, a machine made of mismatched parts that somehow still worked. Then one afternoon, while Elias was chopping wood behind the barn, Ruth came running. "A man's at the road," she yelled. "Ma, he has a horse." Clara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She stepped out with the rifle, heart pounding. Dust drifted in lazy clouds along the path. A rider approached, alone, deliberate, his horse lathered from distance. His clothes were fine, a little too fine for this part of the world. Clara moved Ruth behind her. Elias emerged silently, axe in hand. The rider reined in. He raised both hands in mock surrender. Name's Harlan Dean. I'm lookin' for someone. A woman. 2 girls. Clara didn't respond. Word in town is, a bounty's been posted. Someone's payin' high for her return. Says she's a thief. Took a valuable item from a man with powerful friends. Elias stepped forward. Harlan eyed him. You the woodsman took her in? Elias said nothing. You don't speak. Nothing. Don't need words, Harlan muttered, dismounting. I'm just here to talk. Clara kept the rifle trained. What's the price? Harlan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. 500 in gold. For her. Or just confirmation of where she is. And what happens to her if she goes back? His smile faded. Doesn't matter much to me. I don't write the rules. I just enforce 'em. Elias moved again, just a half step. But it was enough. Harlan raised his hands once more. Easy. I'll be ridin' on. But word travels. If I found you, others will too. Best start movin' again. He mounted slowly, watching them. Woman like her? Pretty. Brave. Somebody important wants her under lock and key. Then he was gone, horse kicking up dirt down the trail. That night, Clara sat by the fire, hands clenched around the stock of the rifle. I can't let them take the girls, she whispered. Not again. Elias lit a lantern, adjusted the wick. He didn't speak, but his jaw tightened. I don't care what I stole. He hit Lila. Threw Ruth against a wall. He called it discipline. I took the only thing he valued, his ledger. All his filthy secret. That's what they want back. Elias finally looked at her. She met his gaze. If they come, I'll fight. He nodded once. The next day they trained harder. Clara practiced from dawn to dusk, bruising her shoulder again. Elias built traps near the entry road, concealed beneath pine needles and mud. Lila helped him dig narrow holes lined with sharpened stick. Ruth carried messages, short notes scratched in charcoal between lookout points they established in trees. 2 days later, the first rider came. Then another. They waited. Silent. Prepared. It wasn't until the 4th arrived, a lean man with a revolver at his hip and 2 companions at his back, that Elias made his move. A tripwire snapped. 1 horse fell screaming. Gunfire split the air. Elias stepped from behind a tree and dropped the leader with a single shot. The others ran. None returned. At dusk, Clara stood outside the cabin, watching the road. Lila joined her. Will they come again? Lila asked. Clara nodded. Maybe. But we'll be ready. Lila was quiet for a long time. He doesn't talk. But he listens. Clara smiled faintly. Yes. He doesn't smile. But he watches Ruth play like it matters. Yes. Lila leaned her head against Clara's arm. Are we going to be okay? Clara didn't answer right away. She watched the trees sway in the wind. The sky shift from pale gold to ash blue. I think so, she said finally. Because we're not running anymore. Inside, Elias sat by the hearth, sharpening the knife again. His movements were methodical, focused. But when Ruth ran in with a flower clenched in her muddy fist and held it up to him, he took it in his calloused hand. He tucked it behind her ear, just once, then nodded. Ruth beamed. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and melted snow. The land still held danger. But it also held the promise of endurance. And even, perhaps, of something more. Something worth standing for. Something worth staying for. The wind was different now, less sharp, carrying the scent of damp soil and wild mint. Spring had taken root. Green crept across the hills in bold defiance of the winter that had nearly broken them all. Clara stood at the edge of the meadow with a basket in hand, gathering wild onions and early dandelions, while Ruth skipped between patches of grass, her laughter startling birds from the underbrush. Lila walked a little behind, ever watchful, eyes scanning the tree-line like a sentinel far older than her years. They had survived the winter. They had survived the men who came to drag them back. But survival was no longer enough. Not for Clara. Not for the girls. Not for Elias. He had changed, though no words passed his lips to say so. He moved differently now, less like a man who lived in isolation, more like someone aware that others depended on him. The cabin bore signs of life everywhere. Freshly mended clothes drying on the line, a rough swing Elias had built for Ruth, and 2 bows hung near the door, one for Lila, one for Clara. It was Clara who first heard the distant rumble one dusk as she stirred a pot of lentils over the fire. Not thunder. Not hooves. Wagons. She rose slowly, listening. Elias emerged from the barn with a small pail of milk in his hand. His head tilted. He heard it too. By nightfall, it became undeniable. Multiple wheels, slow and heavy, moving along the ridge trail. Clara and Elias didn't speak. They packed quickly, only essentials. A small sack of dried meat, the ledger she had hidden beneath the floorboards, matches, a knife, the rifle. The girls were silent as they were roused. Lila's eyes flashed with that same sharp, quiet understanding. Ruth clung to her blanket, uncertain but trusting. Elias led them through the trees, guiding them to the shelter he had built weeks ago. It was camouflaged so well it took even Clara a moment to recognize it, a dugout with timber walls, roofed in bark and moss, barely large enough for them all to lie down. They waited. Hours passed. Then the voices came. Deep male. One southern, one clipped and eastern. A third with a rasp. They weren't looking for a lost woman anymore. They were hunting. From the edge of the shelter, Clara could make out shapes between the trees. Lanterns swinging, boots crunching leaves. At least 6 of them. They passed through the clearing, examined the barn, circled the house. One of them kicked in the cabin door. Another lit a torch. The roof caught quickly. Ruth whimpered. Lila held her tightly, one hand gently covering her mouth. Clara stared straight ahead, hands clenched, jaw set. Elias, crouched by the entrance, didn't move. But his shoulders were tense, breath slow and shallow. Flames bloomed in the night like some cruel blossom. The fire spread to the edge of the coop. Smoke curled up, tainting the clean air of the forest. But Clara didn't look away. That ledger, one voice said clearly near the cabin. Boss says it'll bury 6 men in court if it ever sees daylight. Wants the woman and the pages. Says if the kid's old enough to remember, bring her too. Footsteps receded. Laughter followed. Then silence. It wasn't until dawn that Elias stirred. He motioned for them to stay, then disappeared. When he returned, soot streaked his arms, and his clothes carried the bitter scent of burned pine. He held out a metal tin, scorched but intact. Clara took it, opened it. The ledger was still there. 3 days passed before the men left. They had no way of knowing the cabin had been abandoned just hours before their arrival. Elias had hidden the horses far from the main trail. The women gathered water from a narrow stream down a ravine. They waited until the smoke dissipated and the woods no longer carried the breath of danger. When they finally emerged, the clearing was blackened. The barn half collapsed. Ash fell from the trees like strange gray snow. Clara stood before what had been their home, eyes dry. She didn't speak, but her spine straightened. "We rebuild," she said quietly. "We don't run." Lila nodded. "I want to help," Ruth whispered. "You will," Clara promised. Over the next weeks, they worked like settlers of old. Elias felled trees while Clara and Lila stripped bark and dragged beams with rope. Ruth gathered nails from the ruins of the cabin. Every board hammered into place felt like a declaration, ***, we will not be erased. ***. But rebuilding wasn't only wood and nails. It was trust and laughter cautiously reborn. Clara began humming as she worked, something she hadn't done since before the marriage that had turned her into property. Ruth learned to ride the smaller horse Elias had tamed, her tiny frame perched like a bird on its back. Lila smiled more. Rarely, but enough to feel like spring sunlight cracking through clouds. And then the letter arrived. Elias found it pinned to a tree at the edge of the property. A white envelope sealed with red wax. Inside, a folded note. "You've made this harder than necessary. The man you stole from is patient, but not merciful. That ledger is worth more than your life. He doesn't just want it back. He wants the example made. T.D. Clara read it twice. Her face didn't change. Elias watched her, waiting. I was a governess before he took me, she said, tearing the note slowly. He said I was clever. Too clever for a woman. So he made me his wife. His possession. The paper fell in pieces at her feet. Now I make the rules, she said. We go to town. We find someone who'll listen. We expose him. Elias looked at her with quiet intensity, then nodded. They left the girls at the shelter that night, with promises and full canteens. Elias rode ahead, scouting the trail. Clara followed with the ledger strapped under her cloak, nerves taut but resolve firm. The town was smaller than she remembered, but not so small that secrets stayed hidden forever. They found the sheriff just past midnight, his boots on his desk, hat tilted over his eyes. When Elias placed the ledger on the table, the man sat up fast. Clara opened it, flipped to a page marked with ink stars. Names, dates, transactions. Bribes. Extortion. Trafficking. The sheriff whistled low. You sure you want this public? I want him ruined, Clara said. And the girls safe. That's the price. He nodded slowly. Then we'll ride at first light. Outside, the wind stirred the dust again, but this time Clara didn't flinch. Elias stood beside her, quiet as ever, but his presence no longer distant. She glanced up at him. Thank you. He didn't respond with words, but he tipped his hat just a little, and that was enough. The horizon glowed faint with the promise of morning. Behind them, a new future waited to be built, not in fear, but in defiance. Clara took a deep breath. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of her choosing.